Money is changing. Stablecoins have exploded to over 250 billion in circulation, powering DeFi and cross-border payments, while governments are racing to roll out CBDCs like the digital euro. For some, this is the future of programmable, frictionless money. For others, it's a battleground of regulation, control, and innovation. To help us untangle it all, we're joined by the legendary blockchain Gandalf, Keir Finlow-Bates, making his second appearance on the show. Keir is one of the sharpest voices in the space, known for cutting through hype and explaining complex blockchain concepts with clarity. Today, we'll dive into CBDCs versus stablecoins, the EU versus the US, and the future of money in your wallet, and what it actually might look like. Keir, welcome to Untangling Web3, and welcome back. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thanks. Very good.
Yeah, well, we had you on about, I think it was like a year and a half ago. We were talking about smart contracts. And then afterwards, you basically said, oh, I want to talk about stablecoins. I want to talk about CBDCs. And it's been basically 18 months since that. And now we finally get to talk about the topic that you're so interested in.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to it because it's a fascinating topic and it ties in an awful lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah. Well, since that time, like I say, so much has happened. Like crypto is kind of now a dominant, it was a dominant market at the time, but it seems like there's real institutional adoption. Obviously, governments now seriously getting into the space. So, with that in mind, what is the problem that, say, stable coins are trying to solve versus, say, something like crypto?
Right. So, to start with, firstly, they're actually surprisingly old. I think the first one was launched in 2014 or 2013, something like that. So they've been around for over a decade. And the initial problem they were looking to solve was for people who were trading crypto and wanted a way to sit out of the market and then get back in without having to sell their crypto and then transfer the dollar or euro amount to a bank account and then back into the exchange again. So the idea there, and this is how they were first used, is that you have a stable coin like USDT or something. And when you sell your Bitcoin or Ether or your whatever meme token, you convert it to USDT. And then a month or two later or a day later, you can then sell your USDT back for crypto. And you've sat out what you think might be a bear market. So that was the original idea, and they chugged along like that for a long time. What we're seeing now is that they're being used as a way of having conventional currencies in the crypto markets, because crypto markets have become a lot bigger since then. And people are using them for payments, and people are using them for holding and moving national currency assets in a blockchainy way. I guess that's the simple
Yeah.
way of describing it now.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like it's, as you said, it's evolved from stablecoins essentially being a tool for people to stay within the crypto sphere without
Mm-hmm.
having to, fully use it, but while preserving the value at a given level. Maybe there's a bear market going on they don't want to be exposed to. And now it feels like there's kind of an inflow the other direction where you have kind of nation states and big corporations saying, actually, what we want to inject some of our financial system into crypto via the same kind of mechanism, but for quite a different reason. And from kind of even just if you've been on the sidelines of the last year in the crypto world, it'll be hard to ignore just how much adoption and noise there's been. At least I want to say noise more than adoption, because obviously you get a lot of press releases before these things happen. So what do you think has kind of driven the pace of things happening in the last year? Because there's been so many announcements, so many people saying, stable coins are the killer app now of crypto all of a sudden, which to you and I might seem strange because they've been around chugging along for so long. So what do you think has actually changed to cause that shift in the narrative?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things. Firstly, if I think back to like 2017, 2018, even I used to go to bed at night and wake up in the middle of the night with a nightmare of finding out that Bitcoin was worth nothing, that Ethereum had shut down, and that it was all just a pipe dream that was now over. Now it's really clear that blockchain is relevant and it's here to stay, and it is a new financial innovation that is not just for a bunch of CryptoPunk nerds. It's going to impact the world, and the large financial institutions have woken up to it, or Maybe they woke up to it 5 years ago, and now they're actually saying it. I mean, I'm thinking here, for example, of JP Morgan, who 7 years ago were saying that this is all nonsense. It's now clear that actually, while they were saying it was nonsense, they were working away on what if it wasn't, and they've changed their story. So it's now got legitimacy. There are huge financial institutions and governments who are saying this stuff is real, it's relevant, it's useful. And then you face the problem, well, how do you interface things like the US dollar being a reserve currency of the world with something like Bitcoin or Ethereum? And the answer is you need to have a bridge. You need to be able to say, well, we have assets on a blockchain, but they represent conventional financial assets. And that's where stablecoins step in. And for ordinary people, and indeed even for institutions, they solve the problem of volatility. Blockchain tokens are seen as being very volatile. Some of them are, some of them aren't. We're used to currencies kind of chugging along, especially the big ones, not really changing very much in value, in purchasing power on a day-to-day basis. It's just over years and decades that their value erodes away, and people are familiar with that. So it brings the familiar financial monetary system onto the blockchain. And that means that a lot more people who might have been skeptical now think, well, actually, I could do something with that. It's quite interesting to have a dollar that is programmable, that can be held by a piece of software rather than a human being or an institution, things like that. So suddenly the doors open up. And then the other thing is that the conventional financial system has done a rather poor job at standardizing. We have things like international bank account numbers, but the US doesn't use them. We have all sorts of payment systems, and you get the network effect where if you want to transfer money from country A to country B, you may be using a very different route from transferring money from country A to country C, for example. Whereas blockchain, despite this proliferation of chains and different consensus protocols and transaction formats and even, say, smart contract coding languages, is actually relatively homogeneous in terms of how you go about interfacing with it, compared to the conventional banking system, which is fragmented, often undocumented, often inaccessible to the average person. So I think these things all tie into this. And finance is becoming, well, not more important, but more visible. It's no longer a bunch of grey-haired guys in dark blue suits in expensive offices in some sector of London that nobody else visits. It's become something that more and more people can participate in, set up companies to do stuff. You don't need as much permission or connections to an old boys club to be able to engage in financial activity on a big scale, rather than the kind of day-to-day, I'm going to go and buy some bread with a £5 note. So I think these things all tie into that.
One of the things that I want to jump on there is that you mentioned the idea of the value of fiat and traditional currencies eroding away over years and decades. And when people think of volatility, they tend to think short-term volatility, but the long-term volatility of something like fiat is obviously, like, compare the purchasing power of the dollar and the pound and the euro over 20, 30 years. And it's obviously going down relative to things like Bitcoin, for example. So stables give us, say, some of the benefits of crypto, but the main pro is against the volatility versus, say, something like crypto. Do you see stables as a stopgap? Do you think that we will need them in the ultimate end goal of a world with crypto, or do you think there'll always be a place for them?
Well, you're asking me to predict the future, and that's always hard. Well, what's the old statement? I hate making predictions, especially ones about the future. I mean, I have some kind of ideas and visions of where this may go. I do think that stablecoins are forming an intermediary system. I mean, I believe that we're going through one of the most turbulent financial changes that humanity has seen. You know, there've been a number of kind of shifts in how human beings deal with the world financially over the years, from using rare metals as money, to having paper representations of those rare metals, to detaching the paper from the rare metals and saying it now stands on its own. That's why we use the word fiat. It's by decree that they have value. And now we have things that have value without a government or an organization saying we are the ones backing this. They have value because we have tanks, or because we've got a mandate from some people in power. So this kind of stablecoin thing is where the two meet, where crypto and conventional finance meet, and it provides a bridge. And I think stablecoins will last for quite some time. And I think more and more of our monetary processes will move onto blockchains, just because they're actually, despite people complaining about block times, surprisingly fast compared to conventional finance. They are much more convenient in that they are easier to automate. You're not facing some open banking API that changes every 3 months, and where the documentation is incredibly hard to find, and you have an immensely long KYC process before you can do something as simple as move money from one of your own bank accounts to another. A competent developer today with a bit of blockchain knowledge can do that in 5 minutes. So the stablecoins form the meshing between these two. They make crypto more valid. They make conventional more flexible and more usable. As for the long term, yes, I think that national currencies going on to open public blockchains through the form of stablecoins is the start of the end of them, to be honest, because at some point, people who are using stablecoins, or maybe some government digital fiat currency, will go, hey, I understand this. It's actually easier than I thought it would be. Now I'm going to dabble in some of these other things I hear about. And then eventually it kind of cascades, and you end up with more and more people using things like Bitcoin and Ether and other blockchain tokens for transacting. And then eventually fiat currencies will become less and less relevant.
Today's episode is sponsored by the VeChain Foundation.
Now, we often talk about how emerging technologies like blockchain have the potential to revolutionize sustainability, and VeChain is at the forefront of this green movement with initiatives like VBetterDAO. Let's take a closer look.
Imagine tracking small actions like recycling at low cost, making them valuable assets. These verified records build a massive collective impact, benefiting people through their own actions. Sound a bit complex, but VeChain made it fun. Explore our apps at vbetter.com.
VeChain's goal is to power a new era of sustainable solutions. So if you've got an app idea or just want to earn rewards for small, sustainable actions every day, go check out vbetterdao.com to find out more. And now, back to the show.
Well, I think, to your point, I love the bridge analogy. I think it makes sense because when I think about crypto assets in the kind of whole spectrum now that we have, you kind of can think of the issuance of the asset and the operations of the asset as slightly separate. And if you think of a typical crypto asset like a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, potentially, you have both of those are being kind of done in a decentralized, distributed way. Then you have the stable coins where the issuance is kind of still centralized to a third party, but the operations is somewhat decentralized by the nature of how they're being transacted. And then to go to a third path that is potential, then if we have both of those things being done in a centralized manner, essentially, we have something that looks a bit like a CBDC, I think. And you said there are one of many potential futures. I want to get maybe not your strong arm for what CBDCs are meant to be and represent, but I think if you could just define them as a separate category, and define them in terms of how they differ potentially from stable coins, then I think it'd be good to start that discussion on the various merits of each.
Right. So if we look at stable coins, you have a company like Tether or Circle, and they're now fortunately under some regulation in that they're required to prove that they have backing assets. They're not allowed to pay yields on stable coins, and we should revisit that because it's an interesting one. And they have to guarantee that they will redeem these blockchain tokens for real dollars, real in quotes, as real as money is, when requested to under the terms and conditions. I think, for example, Tether is only required to redeem USDT for dollars if it's an amount of more than $100,000, for example. But the fact is that you should be able to get your money out. But what Tether is doing here is it's receiving dollars from you and me, and it's putting them into treasury bonds or other investments. So it's only supposed to issue USDT tokens in a one-to-one match with conventional dollars that they have received. And as a result, you can say, well, the USDT or USDC is backed by these assets sitting in these financial instruments. And the idea is that they're meant to be, blue chip financial instruments, things like treasury bonds, which have about as close to guaranteed payouts as you can get. They're not allowed to go and shove it all into some startup that one of the Tether executives or Circle executives happen to stumble across. So if you now look at a CBDC, well, that's a central bank digital currency. If a central bank were to take the approach of issuing some amount of the currency that they're responsible for on a blockchain like Ethereum as an ERC20 token, suddenly the question of backing becomes very different. They're the one institution that doesn't have to back their digital token because they can just create the money to do so. So that makes them very different from a bank or a stablecoin issuer. And it's kind of odd when you think about it, that they could just, it starts to illustrate the fact that this money is being created out of thin air. Because what does it mean for the European Central Bank to back an ERC20 representation of a euro? And then we move on to, well, what are central banks looking at doing? And what I see if we pick, say, two of the most important ones, the Federal Reserve in the US and the ECB under Christine Lagarde in Europe, I'm not seeing much in the way of pronouncements from the US, the Fed, that they're kind of letting it be private, that it's private companies that are issuing digital versions and they're just running business as usual, the way they have for decades in the US. The European approach is very different. They've been talking about having a digital euro for years. It's always in kind of a, we're investigating, we haven't made any firm decisions, and yet when you look back over it, it looks like they've been traveling down a railroad running straight towards one particular goal. And I think the ECB is rather concerned about the way that all this blockchain and crypto stuff has progressed, because, well, there could be a number of reasons. I think it's a lot to do with control. Europe's very centrally planned compared to, say, the US. And they see stablecoins and things like that as a threat. So when you look at what they are proposing with the digital euro, it's not, we're going to mint ERC20 tokens on Ethereum at all. There's not even really any talk about blockchain. It's likely to be a database in some servers operated by the European Central Bank. So yeah, a very, very different beast. And really, to me, it looks almost like they're going to be offering banking services with the digital euro. And then to mollify the banks, they're saying, but people will only be allowed to hold a couple of €1,000 worth of these things, which in my mind makes them completely pointless. But I'm on record as being quite skeptical about the European Central Bank's approach, both from technical terms, from the promises they're making, like how it's going to be possible to transact them offline. They keep saying they know how to do this, but they never tell us how. And all the leading cryptographers out there who've been working on this problem for decades don't know how. So maybe they have a secret genius in a basement somewhere who they're going to announce. All these limits on them, it just and this constant we're thinking about it, we're not going to do it, and of course lots of videos that quite frankly look like propaganda to me coming out, always with young female interns walking enthusiastically in front of EU buildings talking how wonderful this is going to be and how everybody's going to be able to use it and how not to worry. And that kind of stuff makes me worry.
So is the main concern for you that the backing is no longer independent. It's the backing that you say you can just create money out of nowhere without having to peg it to anything. In the same way that a lot of people speculated, say 5 years ago, USDT was in a similar boat and potentially they weren't declaring their assets and didn't have a one-to-one peg. Is that the main concern then between a CBDC versus, say, a USDT that's now regulated?
No, because national currencies issued by central banks are not backed by anything. Well, if you ask Christine Lagarde, she will tell you emphatically that the euro is backed by the European Central Bank. And then you ask, well, what does that mean? And you don't get an answer. Well, it's backed by a bunch of bureaucrats in a building somewhere. I mean, it's a bit of a strange sort of Alice in Wonderland world when you start digging into how our money systems work. And we have all these weird mechanisms in place where central banks and wholesale banks and retail banks are selling each other financial instruments to create the money. It's kind of like they're both, I borrow off you and you borrow off me. So we have nothing between us. And you lend me a note saying I owe you £100, and I give you a note saying I lend you £100. Now, in a sort of a world where conservation rules apply, like conservation of energy and mass and stuff like that, there should be a total of 0. But in the financial world, that means we now have 200, right? You see the same in economics, where I pay you £30 to do a job, you pay Jack £30 and he pays me £30. We're all square. But from the government's point of view, we now have £90 worth of economic activity. And this is brilliant. And we can post it as part of our GDP. Right. So they're kind of, financial systems do create stuff out of nothing. And in a sense, they have to, right? Because we have the real world with things like land and commodities and people doing work and timber growing in the form of trees and all, stuff's being created. If we're going to have a virtual representation of it, which is what money is, and of things like people's capacity to work and the value of ideas that people have, that has to come out of somewhere. And the answer is it has to come out of nowhere. You can try to tie it to these things, but that gets very difficult because you're trying to value things with something that has no inherent value. I mean, you don't want your money to have value because then you see the problem that you have with, for example, gold, where gold is used as a store of value. It's also got industrial uses. It's very annoying to the industry that gold is used as a store of value because it means that this wonderful corrosion-proof electric conductor is 100 times more expensive in dollars than it needs to be.
Well, I think this is such an interesting, obviously we're getting into the philosophy of money all of a sudden, which I think is unavoidable when we're talking about, stable coins and CBDCs. I hadn't quite thought of things in the sense that you put it there, which is interesting because it's almost like when we decide to try and put fiat currency into the blockchain world, then it forces you to ask some uncomfortable questions about the nature of it, right? Because you're lifting you're saying, I'm trying to virtually represent something. What is it that I'm virtually trying to represent? And that's when it all becomes a little bit more difficult. I'm interested, as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, how does this all compare then to something like, a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, where there's been a debate for many, many years from the other side, from the kind of old financial world and the fiat currency issuing side? Where's the intrinsic value of Bitcoin and Ethereum? So how do you think the three of those things stack up? So the actual kind of native cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and then CBDCs and issued fiat currency on blockchain in terms of a value standpoint.
Well, I have to warn you, you just used a triggering phrase to me there, the intrinsic value of Bitcoin.
Inherent value, I think.
Sorry, inherent.
It's okay. We won't talk about it. There are plenty of videos that I produced that are available on my YouTube site where I talk about the intrinsic value of things and how academics and central banks misuse it to mislead us. But anyway, so you're talking about where does the value of these three things come from, right? And
and also in a sense, if we're just trying to use any of these in a currency-like way, then how do you think we should be thinking of them in terms of their inherent or day-to-day value? Let's use an easier word.
Okay. So the first thing you have when you want to measure the value of something, you need to have a unit of measurement for that. And of course, this is the funny thing, is that we use fiat currencies. So people talk about, hey, Bitcoin is now worth $125,000, right? And it's a very narrow and quite peculiar way of valuing things. Right. What was the Oscar Wilde quote? A cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing.
Mhm.
I mean, you have this issue. We see it in society. The people looking after their elderly parents is immensely valuable to society, but we don't put a dollar value on it. People working in the banking industry get paid massive salaries. Are they proportional to the value of the service that these bankers provide, or are we just giving them that money because they happen to be very close to where the money is created? And in general, when you happen to be near the wellspring of something, you get more of it. So back to the value of Bitcoin, I think it's starting to become clear that the main value of Bitcoin is this hard limit on how many there can be. It is truly the only scarce thing in the universe. And you can go and look at the code and see that as long as humanity continues to act en masse the way they do in terms of running Bitcoin nodes and not making changes to it, it'll continue that way. And there's a lot of friction and resistance if you were to try and change it. There'd be an awful lot of people, some of whom hold very strong opinions, that you would have to convince to change it. And this idea of absolute digital scarcity is a really, really powerful one. I mean, I think somebody I saw the other day was giving the example of gold is valuable because it's scarce. But as it becomes more valuable, we look for more techniques to extract more of it. So the sea is full of gold. It's not economically viable to try and filter out gold atoms from the sea. But if the price of gold went high enough, at some point it would become worthwhile to work on how to get that gold out. If a solid gold asteroid were to crash onto Earth, ignoring the fact that it might, destroy 95% of life on the planet, it would immediately devalue gold, and we have no guarantee that won't happen. And we have no guarantee that we're not going to wake up tomorrow and find that they've found a massive gold reserve in Siberia, where they equal to the amount of gold that is currently in Fort Knox, which would immensely deflate the value of gold. With Bitcoin, we know that this much comes along every 10 minutes, and it'll continue to reduce in how much is produced over time, and eventually it's going to cap out at just under 21 million of these. Plus, people are losing them all the time. So having something that is truly scarce makes it very useful for a store of value. I don't know if you've read the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's trilogy, but I think at the end of the third book, there's this group called the Golgafrinchians, and they decide to use leaves on trees as money. And of course, there's an immense problem in that they're so common that the value of money, their money, is vastly deflated by all the forests. And their solution is to burn down all the forests, right? And I think that illustrates the problem you have with money, is that there needs to be enough of it that you can do sensible transactions. You don't want to be transacting with minuscule flakes of gold, but there can't be too much of it, because then you're carrying wheelbarrows of it around. So that's the Bitcoin side of things. And I think I went on a little bit too long there, so sorry about that.
Can I ask a question on that? Because I've seen a lot of people say it's absolute scarcity, like this is never going to change. And you even started with that and then kind of caveated it a little bit to say, well, there's people with very strong opinions that would not want to change it. How absolute is that? Like, I'm not saying it's very likely that, the scarcity, the upper limit could change, but I see more and more people posting as Bitcoin becomes more centralized, there's potentially more external influence to maybe change that upper limit, not in the next 10, 20 years, but what about 50 years? Is it possible that absolute scarcity we're also comfortable with is an absolute?
Well, you can do it tomorrow. You can release a fork of the Bitcoin blockchain where you say, as of today, we're going back to issuing 50 Bitcoin a block, right? And that would bump the amount up immensely. And it would be a fork. And then it's up to all the miners to decide if they want to jump on it or not. And in fact, forks of Bitcoin have happened on numerous occasions. The most well-known ones are Bitcoin Cash by Roger Ver and Bitcoin Satoshi Vision by Craig Wright, who is no longer to say that he's Satoshi. So there goes that vision. But then you have the question, who jumps on which bandwagon? And if you look at the dollar prices of Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, they show that it's not the mainstream one. If you look at the number of nodes that are being run for it, whereas it's Bitcoin Core that has the lion's share of the support. So if there were a proposal that was then acted on to make a Bitcoin fork where the amount of Bitcoin was increased, the total cap was increased, some groups might decide that they would follow that. Others might stick with the original one. So in that sense, the answer, I guess, is yes and no. And my feeling is at the moment that it's one of these kind of core things about Bitcoin that the majority of people don't want to change. So I think there wouldn't be much traction for a... I mean, what would the purpose be? Why would you want to increase the amount? And the answer is somebody must be thinking that they can make money out of this, right?
Yeah.
And then the question is, who is it? Now, if it's all the miners, then they might well do that, right? If we say, and of course, they're the ones getting the block reward. But on the other hand, they may also look at it and say, well, yeah, I'll get more Bitcoin, but the value of it will be less and the confidence in Bitcoin may drop. So actually, thinking about it rationally, it's not a good idea to jump on this new chain because it's going to give me more Bitcoins that are worth far, far less. And my dollar value of these things as a result is reduced. So I'll stick with the traditional 21 million cap. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've seen it mooted in the past, not for quite a while actually, but I saw it mooted, I think in the context of just the number system not, having enough space to capture enough value. I think that was the argument, right? And I think at that point you're doing pretty well and you don't have to worry so much. And also, to your point, I think at that point, if it's more like it's like making the system quantum secure, right? If it needs to, if you need to add decimal places to make sure it can literally be the main use of currency used across the whole world, then it's not going to undermine confidence necessarily to implement that change. But I think we're a long, long way off that yet. And I think so. Just to couch it again. So, what do you think would be the optimal kind of end state for these three categories? I think I can guess for one of them, but in terms of at least in a world where we have, native currencies and then, native assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum, for example, and then you have your stable coins, and let's include CBDCs as kind of a comparative example. So how do you think ideally the world would be using them in 20 years' time?
Right. I mean, I think firstly, my opinion is that the mechanisms behind them and the backing required may well differ. But if a central bank were to issue its currency on a blockchain as an ERC20 token, then from our perspective, they wouldn't differ much from stablecoins, right? And central banks would become the leading stablecoin issuers in that respect. So I think you can, in this, because we're not looking in detail at stablecoins versus CBDCs. If you step back and look at crypto versus stablecoins and CBDCs, ignoring the irrelevance of the EU releasing its own database-backed system and not having anything to do with blockchain, which is, I think, fairly likely. Blockchain stablecoins and blockchain CBDCs are pretty much the same from the end user's point of view. Okay. And so then we're stuck with stablecoins, representations of jurisdictional currencies versus crypto. And the thing is that stablecoins include centralized controls. If you look at the smart contract for Tether or Circle or PayPal USD, they all contain a freeze option so that a particular account can no longer move coins around. Some of them contain the ability to then burn the coins that are in a frozen account. And there's this mint function. So it's all in the hands of the entity controlling that smart contract. And for all of us, that's really the same as everyday life, right? I don't have any control over how many pound notes the Bank of England prints, or what kind of bond sales go on to inject more money into the economy, or what kind of fractional reserve holdings are required this month to multiply the money supply. And similarly, I don't have control over Tether's freezing, unfreezing, minting, burning of USDT. When you move to crypto, it becomes different. Yes, there are restrictions and rules, but they feel more like physical laws, like gravity, right? And Bitcoin has these rules; they're baked in there. We all have to play by them. There are no special players who get a hall pass for Bitcoin. You, me, and the governor of the Bank of England are all beholden to the same rules. And it's on a censorship-resistant system. So with a bank account or with USDT or whatever, I can be censored. The bank can say, you can no longer have your funds. We're investigating you for money laundering. Or Tether can say, we've had a request from the FBI to freeze this account. Sorry, you can't move those USDT. With Bitcoin, they can't stop me. Well, unless they lock me in a jail cell with no access to the internet. And this is where I think it's going to get interesting, because I do have the sense that we're moving into more and more authoritarian times with more and more surveillance and restrictions. I'm not living in the UK at the moment, so I have a bit of a skewed view of it as to how it's reported abroad. But there's lots of what to me now look like rather odd things rather going on in terms of how policing is handled and what people can and cannot say under what circumstances. And I'm not going to go into the politics of that, but
get censored.
Yeah, but it feels like there are more and more restrictions, and governments have more and more capacity to put cameras up, to request information about our finances, to hold data on us. And that's worrying. Now we have this second financial system that they can't control. So it's quite possible that it's those restrictions that start moving people over. So that's the second step, right? The first step is onto the blockchain because stablecoins are there, and it's just like digital banking. And then when people are familiar with that, moving on to freer financial systems where those controls are not so much in place. And this has upsides and downsides. I mean, there are good reasons for having anti-money laundering legislation and know your customer and counter-terrorism funding regulation, because most of us don't want people laundering money. But it's there hovering in the background when you look at the idea of money that can't be censored.
Yeah, I think again, we're getting into we're broaching very difficult questions, right? Which is speaks to the not just the impact that cryptocurrencies have had, the fact that we are having this conversation, but also how difficult they are to answer. And I think I broadly agree with you. I think it seems to me you have the class of financial instruments that we're going to see, the stable coins are ushering in, issued by financial institutions or governments. They're a horse for a course, okay, and they have these protections baked in which make complete sense, and they solve a set of problems either for the institutions themselves or the customers, that we will be able to access new products via them. But then the kind of native crypto side, like a Bitcoin or Ethereum, is solving a very orthogonal, different problem set, right? And that's more for the very extreme cases, which I think we should definitely have you back on in the future, Keir, to get into the weeds of some of those. But maybe we need a bit more preparation and to see what happens in the world before then. But yeah, Keir, it's been a real pleasure to have you on. I think we could talk about this stuff for days, but maybe we should do another session another time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity, and let's make sure it's not 18 months in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because I mean, honestly, at the current rate, who knows where we'll be by then. On that note, we'll say thank you for listening, and you can join us next time to untangle a little more Web3.